Okay, so from the Liberty Coalition, they had a religious freedom from vaccination coercion article, and they had and basically these were
Well,
like
it's a
the
declaration, and just for context, they have about 15 people that have signed it. And then if you go to the view all signatures page, currently there's 13,000 people who signed um,
oh, okay.
the let's say the declaration.
Hmm. Hmm.
So obviously make sure it's in the show notes page. Um,
Yeah. Okay, and so now there's the three main arguments I thought were really interesting, um, that we can kind of look at real quick. Is the first one is Christians are required to honor the sanctity of human life, including prenatal human life, and therefore protect unborn children from medical experimentation in the production of some vaccines. Genesis chapter 1:27, Genesis 9, verse 6, and then Psalm 139, verse 13 to 16. So yeah, now you can launch off on that part.
yeah. So I mean, and that's I think what we said on the episode with Rebecca. Um, I think and I think she sort of talked through that issue very well. As me and you had a good back and forth as well regarding, hey, if someone's conscience is, I don't want to, take any vaccine that is, has aborted fetal cells or uses aborted fetal cells in production. Our conversation was, you can challenge that conviction or that, let's call it opinion based on earlier discussion. You can challenge that opinion, but if that person is not convinced by your pushback or challenging, asking them to then go against that, to me, that's a really good example. And I sort of already said this. That's an example, in my opinion, of religious conviction that they're having that would really, really struggle to not meet the definitions that they've laid out. Like I don't see how if someone holds that position again, you need to hold it consistently. With regards to a good example on that episode I brought up was Al Mohler's discussion on in vitro, right? Making sure that you're not aborting the extra fertilized eggs because you didn't want to have 6 kids by accident because of the method that in vitro occurs, right? So there's a requirement to be consistent in, if you are trying to make that argument, my position or challenge to people would be, you better be consistent in that position.
Mhm.
Otherwise,
Yeah.
the religious conviction argument sort of falls on its face.
Yeah. For me, it's just a matter of I don't see that holding up long term. Once they start coming out with other vaccines that don't use aborted fetal cells. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think I could be wrong, but for the most part, it almost always shows up in production, or sorry, in confirmation testing. Um, but it doesn't always show up in the final product.
Yeah. All right. The next point is Christian parents are instructed to nurture, provide for, and raise up their children in the Lord, a responsibility not given by God to the state or any other human agency. Deuteronomy chapter 6, um, verse 5 to 9, and in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4.
Mm-hmm. Why did this stand out to you? Like,
It was one of those things that it never occurred to me. And I guess, these ones were
mm,
informative. So like, I'm thinking this is an issue of sphere sovereignty.
mhm.
So I think this is a good argument for parents choosing not to vaccinate their children. And for those who don't remember sphere sovereignty is God has created institutions with their own um, circle, sphere, reach of responsibility. So, for example, those institutions are the individual, the family, the church, the state. And so sometimes those spheres overlap. And then you have kind of some spheres overextending itself. And so this sphere is in relation from the institution of the family, the home, and the state saying, "Oh, vaccinate your kids." And as a parent, you have a right to say what your kids can do or not do.
Yeah, and I think that's a bigger issue than just this vaccination stuff. It's sort of showing up in the U.S. more so with regards to them. In Canada, we're so socialist that I would argue there's very little pushback. Plus, the way the systems work, right? In the US, you've got the school board system. You've got much more like, elections and different things that give people the ability to sort of, let's call it, change course. And
Mhm.
so the reason why, like, there's videos, and our boy Corey DeAngelis he has a tweet. I'll try to find it. Basically, he's showing that these, school board execs or teachers union execs essentially saying, like, parents being responsible for their children's education is like wrong-headed. Like, it's essentially that they think the children are property of the state. And I think we in society are going to continually see that trajectory where the state continues to try to claim sovereignty over your children. And so I think as much as you brought it up here, I think it is a huge issue. Um, and people will throw out the worst examples, right? Like, oh, what about the parent who beats their kid? Or like, what about the parent who doesn't care for their kid's education? And I would say there's room for a conversation. How does society deal with those things? But the answer isn't to make the children primarily responsibility of the state.
Mhm.
You know,
That's good. That's good. And now the last point I thought was interesting, or probably pretty good argument, or we'll see. Um, every Christian is commanded not to pass judgment upon others over disputable matters, but rather to honor personal religious convictions and individual liberty. Open bracket, including anything one understands to be unhealthy, such as certain foods, smoking, drinking alcohol, or employing experimental drugs for treating illness. Close bracket. And so that's from Romans 14,
19.
verse 19, and First Corinthians 8, 1 to 13.
Yeah, that I would just say one thing I really appreciate about the Liberty Coalition, they have, scripture references for basically almost every single component of this
Mhm,
declaration, at least
mhm,
for the non legal stuff, right? When it gets to
mhm.
constitutional stuff, they
Yeah,
obviously
yeah, yeah,
don't.
yeah,
But
yeah, for sure.
um, yeah, every point, which is about, they're like, whereas, there's about 10 of them. And they all have scripture references, which I
Mhm,
fully appreciated.
mhm. So what do you think? What do you think about this section?
I to be honest, I think it's really important with respect to unity of the church, right? And again, if I go back to the episode with Rebecca, I was very impressed. Impressed may not be the right word, but I was very satisfied with the types of things she was saying about the importance of the church. For those that have a different opinion than you with regards to vaccines, you know, essentially don't allow this to be a divisive issue within your church. And so I think that's where I think people on both sides have to really check their heart, check their, mental state with regards to those that have made a different decision than them.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm. Like, love your neighbor.
oh, you mean the
That's usually
the
the.
the exploitation of that statement?
Well, it's funny. I've never said this before. Um, with the issue of love your neighbor, but I think, and this is a point from Mark Dever, and he said, we have to look at texts and say, okay, well, can you derive the opposite from it? Because sometimes we throw
Mm,
around these Bible verses and we're like, well, yeah, if you see it from that perspective, but it can easily be turned around to be made to argue against your point, right?
mhm,
So the way, like, so for example, love your neighbor, right? From the other perspective would be, for the anti-vax perspective would be, okay, love your neighbor as you love yourself.
mhm,
Okay, leave me alone. I'll leave you alone.
mhm. Well, and the statement I like to use is loving your neighbor also includes telling them when they believe a falsehood or telling them the
Well,
truth.
yeah. So I mean, yeah. So so sometimes with those passages, it's just like, yeah, well, it's general enough, it's implicit enough, to kind of leave. You can take different angles, and you can it can support either argument, either side.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, but I think when I look at this section, what it makes me think is that both of these passages from Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians 8, so both of these passages are about the Christian conscience in the church. And I don't see the state or businesses honoring um, these convictions.
Mm.
Right. And so that's why, I was just like, well, based on the hermeneutic that the government is using, um, yeah, there isn't an explicit verse, because that's what I was looking through when I was reading through the report. There isn't an explicit verse that says, um, you know, don't get the jab. Right.
Yep.
So, so you're kind of like, okay, so now the government's saying, okay, well, if you're going to start applying, if you're going to start looking at preferences and opinions, then, yeah, you don't have a leg to stand on. And I think that's the trick. And I think with religious exemption, the religious exemption, as was talking with Gideon, shout to Gideon, um, and Gideon made a great point about um, religious exemption isn't for Christians, right? It covers the government's butt, not the Christians' butt. It's a loophole. It's a loophole, and it's a general. It's just a general clause that the government mentions, but they don't plan to enforce. Right. So, for example, if the
Yeah.
government, if you right, so let's say you get a letter of religious exemption, right, and you go to Jack Astor's, right, they go throw you out on your Astor.
Yeah.
you know, you know what I mean? Like, what we get a call the manager? Hey, look, yo, the man's using Romans 14. Yo, you can't exegete. Like that's not a like that's no. We're not gonna sit there and have Bible study in Denny's like we used to back in the day and say, oh, okay, yeah, he's using Romans 14 in the right context. Allow him in, get him a pancake. It doesn't work like that,
Yep.
right? So it's one of those bait and switch. So for Christians have to be mindful of like, okay, you know what, yo, it's not really a thing. This, religious exemption is not really a thing. They're just doing it to make sure it looks like they're not violating people's uh quote unquote constitutional rights. And I mean quote because they're not really trying to do that.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's sort of the religious exemption thing is at least maybe it was intentionally put in place, even the original constitution, right? Like it was there as a placeholder. And if you look at the trajectory of the government, I would argue they're continually going to try to undermine it, right?
Mhm.
Prime example that comes to my mind is when we had the episode on Trinity College in BC, or Trinity,
Oh yeah, that was a long time ago.
right? And in essence, they pulled this crazy level of human rights stuff that to me just doesn't hold up to a reasonable scrutiny of the Constitution. But somehow it did, right? And it's like if you can make a good argument to get around the religious exemption, well, it looks like the government, the courts, they're willing to do so, but you have to have a good argument.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. No, good point.
Please subscribe and hit the bell to stay up to date. If you liked or disliked the snippet, give it a like and share your 2 cents with us in the comment section. And remember, 6 cents makes change.